Good evening and welcome to the 2024 Lieutenant Governor Candidate Forum. I am Pelin Kohn, a member of the Board of Directors of the League of Women Voters of Vermont. The League of Women Voters is a trusted, national, nonpartisan organization. We do not endorse or oppose any party or candidate. Our mission is to empower voters and defend democracy. We have 3 candidates running for Lieutenant Governor of Vermont. 2 of them are here today, John Rogers and David Zuckerman. Unfortunately, Ian Diamondstone is unable to attend due to a death in the family. The League is hosting today's forum with the St. Johnsbury Athenaeum and KATV, specifically for you, the voter, to meet your candidates, hear what they have to say, and ask questions on issues that are important to you. Now, I'd like to call on Tom McCann, our moderator, to introduce the candidates. Tom is a former English teacher, principal, and library administrator who lives in Montpelier and writes commentary and feature articles for several publications. Tom?
Thank you, Pelin. It is wonderful to be here in this beautiful building in this beautiful part of Vermont. I always love being in St. Johnsbury. I'll tell you a little bit about the process before we get going. Each of the candidates will have 2 minutes for an opening statement, and then we will go through questions. We have some questions that were submitted ahead of time. Also, we hope that, I know some of you have already written questions, hope more of you will, because we would like to use as many questions as possible from the audience. So we have Jez, who's reading them and organizing them for me, who will give me the questions in an organized manner. In the event that questions are very similar, I will only ask one, or I'll combine them or something like that. And also, we have a volunteer timer in the front row to help the candidates, to remind them when they have 1 minute, when they have 30 seconds, and when they have 10 seconds left. So, candidates do not need to take 2 minutes. They certainly can, but if they go for a shorter time, that allows us to fit more questions in overall. The candidates drew lots ahead of time, and we determined that David Zuckerman will be going first for the opening statement and also for the closing statement. And John Rogers will be going second for the opening statement and for the closing statement. But first, I'm going to read biographies that the candidates sent to us. We were asked them to provide us with brief biographies, and they both did that, and they both kept them brief, which is a real good sign. So these, again, were written by the 2 candidates. First one from John Rogers. I was raised on a dairy farm in the Northeast Kingdom, where my family has been since 1838. I was the 5th generation to grow up on the farm and live in the original farmhouse built by my ancestors in 1840. Now the 6th and 7th generations of the Rogers family are working on the farm. I graduated from Sacred Heart High School in Newport in 1983. I graduated from New Hampshire Vocational Technical College in Berlin, New Hampshire in 1985 with an associate's degree. Soon after that, I started my own masonry business that I still run today. I specialize in dry stone work and excavation. I served in the legislature for 16 years, 8 in the House of Representatives and 8 in the state Senate as a Democrat. I also served for 2 terms on the Judicial Nominating Board while I was in the Senate. I've always worked hard to represent my constituents in a nonpartisan way. And the statement from David Zuckerman. David Zuckerman has been a public servant for 24 of the last 28 years and owns and operates an organic vegetable, pork, CBD, and chicken farm. He has led and worked collaboratively on key issues to Vermonters, like marriage equality, cannabis justice, medical aid in dying, diversified farming, and organized labor. With many pressing issues facing our state, Lieutenant Governor Zuckerman is dedicated to taking his years of service and continuing to moderate the Senate with efficiency, while elevating the voices and concerns of Vermonters from a statewide platform. Right now, Lieutenant Governor Zuckerman is working closely with the legislature to improve access to affordable housing, make our communities more climate resilient, and our tax burden fair and equitable. Lieutenant Governor Zuckerman knows that together we can build a state that works for all, not just for the privileged few. And as Pellin said, the independent candidate, Ian Diamondstone, was planning to be here tonight, couldn't be here because of a family emergency. He did send an email, and he said, in part, "I am so sorry. I was really looking forward to meeting everyone." So, wish him well with the family emergency that he is away for. So, first we're going to start with opening statements. So we have, after this I'll call the candidates David and John, but first call here it's Lieutenant Governor David, Lieutenant Governor and Lieutenant Governor candidate David Zuckerman. Opening statement.
Sure, and thank you everyone for coming, and the Athenaeum, as well as the League of Women Voters for hosting this. I remember a couple years ago we had a wonderful conversation as well, and I look forward to that tonight. Along with some of what was just read off, I just want to give a little more background. I was raised outside of Boston with a mom and dad who really instilled in me the idea that work hard, be the best you can be, treat everyone with respect, and try to make the world a better place. And that stuck with me throughout my whole life, that each of us can be, potentially have opportunity, but not that everyone does. My mom was actually on the school board, and she fought hard to make sure there was a full range of courses available for helping folks that needed to catch up, as well as gifted courses for those that were just on a path or their brain just worked in a way that things clicked in certain ways, whether it was science or arts, math, language, whatever it might be. And the idea was that we all come from different perspectives and different circumstances, but we need to make sure we have an education system that makes it so that everybody has an opportunity to be whatever they want to be, as long as they also work hard and put their head to the grindstone. One of the things I really loved about Vermont when I came here to go to the University of Vermont was that I found a community that was broad in its views, but together in its respect for each person with their views, whether people agreed or disagreed. People could have strong discussions and still, at the end of the discussion, respect each other and not attack each other. And that's been changing in the political atmosphere around this country, and it's creeping into Vermont, not the same as in other places. But I will continue to be the moderator of the Senate with a hand that says every voice is welcome, and at the end of the day, we have to respect the system and respect each other, no matter what the outcome. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And next we have Lieutenant Governor candidate John Rogers.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank the League for holding this, and what a spectacular venue. After the first televised debate that we had, it was clear my opponent's answers to everything is more taxes and fees. And as I've traveled around the state, I've heard from people of all political parties that they're tired of the crushing rents, spiraling property taxes, and unnecessarily high electric and fuel bills. And if you're tired of the crushing costs that the legislature and my opponent have put on Vermonters, then I'm your candidate and I want to be your voice. I served in the legislature for 16 years as a Democrat, and my values have not changed, but the party has. The party has been taken over by the progressives, and they have forgotten the poor and the working class people that the Democratic Party used to represent. I believe that there progressive elitist values have destroyed the Democratic Party and are destroying Vermont by making it unaffordable and literally unsafe to live in. I've always supported women's rights and everyone's right to bodily autonomy. I'm the only candidate who truly respects women and their personal boundaries, and I will always fight for women's rights and equality. While serving in the House of Representatives, I was the only member of the legislature that lost my seat for supporting marriage equality. So when I say that I support everyone's rights, I truly mean everyone's rights. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So the first question, and we will be alternating between which candidate I ask first. I occasionally mix that up, so just stop me if I move on and forget to give you a chance to answer. I don't do it too often, but it's happened. So anyway, but the first question is one that the league gave to the two candidates in advance. And so John will be answering first on this, and then David second. What are your top 3 priorities if elected? John?
Yes, thank you. As I travel around the state, top of mind for everyone is affordability. Property taxes, number 1. The legislature has done 38 studies. They have spent millions of dollars on those studies, hiring experts and consultants, and they've done nothing to change the funding formula. They've been negligent as far as I'm concerned, and it's time to start from scratch and build a funding formula from scratch that provides quality education for our youth at a rate Vermonters can afford. Second, public safety. Did a walk around downtown Burlington a couple days ago talking with merchants. They no longer let their employees walk back to their car alone. They have homeless people all around, people openly using drugs. I talked with one store owner that says every day when he gets to the parking lot, he has to sweep up needles. We have a serious drug problem in all of our cities and towns. We need to give law enforcement and the judiciary the tools they need to deal with the people that are bringing these drugs into our state, because it is also causing the majority of the violence that we're dealing with. Regular shootouts in the park in Burlington and in downtowns all around the state. 30 seconds for the last issue. I guess there's a lot of other issues. I guess probably housing is the next most important. We are short on housing. Housing's extremely expensive. The only way to get the cost of housing down is to reduce property taxes, electric bills, heating bills, all things that the cost has been driven up by the legislature.
Thank you, John. David?
Well, thank you. I would say the broad topic of affordability, which to me includes affordable housing, it includes property taxes, and it includes an economic system whereby everybody who works and is working 40 or unfortunately 50 or 60 hours a week can afford to pay their basic needs: a roof over their head, food on the table, transportation, healthcare, and the ability to get a good education. And those are a lot of topics, many of which are much bigger than Vermont. When we talk about the price of housing, it's about supply and demand. When 10,000 people move here from southern New England, it's like a eyelash falls off their face. They don't even notice. But when 10,000 people move to Vermont, it blows up the housing system. That's what's driving the cost of housing, free market reality. To build more affordable housing, we actually need to put money into affordable housing. And I supported the House bill to do that. And yes, it involved taxes on people who make over $500,000. The top 1% of Vermont have earnings of $800,000 a year, whereas the rest of Vermont, including myself, the 99%, average $50,000. Now, I'm lieutenant governor, I make more than $50,000, but the average. The second I would talk about, along with affordability and all those topics, is also climate. Right here, you've lived through the disasters of the last couple of years. Across Vermont, we've seen the flooding that's happened. That is not just Vermont's cause, of course. it's something that's happening all over the world. But U.S. citizens, and in fact, Vermonters, we drive farther because we live far apart. We have an impact, and we need to do what we can to reduce that impact on the climate. And I would add, yes, absolutely public safety. And the question is, how do we do it? Do we address public safety around mental health issues? Do we address public safety around economic disparities when people are homeless and desperate? What do? They have to figure out a way to provide themselves. And of course, the drug crime. We have to address that issue as well and the underlying causes of drug issues.
Thank you, David. The next question is also from the League of Women Voters, but the candidates did not receive it in advance. And David will be first on this and John second. Summarize and prioritize the duties of the Lieutenant Governor.
Sure. Ultimately, John knows this well as well. There are 3 technical duties of the Lieutenant Governor. The first one is to be number 2. The governor is number 1, and if something happens to the governor, as we saw, obviously, when Governor Snelling passed away and Howard Dean became governor a number of decades ago, you have to be prepared to be governor any day, any moment, if the governor becomes incapacitated or can no longer perform the functions of being governor. Having served in the House and the Senate and as lieutenant governor, working with secretaries and agency personnel through all those years, and running a small business, which is very different than running governance, of course, I'm prepared to do that. The second job, which is the one that most people are most familiar with, is presiding over the Senate. You're essentially the town moderator, we all know that position in our local governance, of the 30-member Senate. You're the parliamentarian. You call on who's speaking, but also sometimes that includes calling on certain people to bring the tone down and back to the issues before you call someone else who might fire it up more in a way that starts getting personal. Or you call the balls and strikes on the process if an amendment is germane or things like that. And then the third position, a third role, is to be the one of 3 people on the Committee on Committees, which is the most bureaucratically named committee that exists in the universe. And you appoint with 2 other senators, all of the senators to their respective positions on the standing committees, on the other committees that meet on occasion, and also citizens. You draw on citizens all across the state to fill boards and positions that the Senate and the House and the governor often put positions on. Then it's up to you, and I've done a number of issues-oriented tours around the state, whether it was a provocative movie series, whether it was the Banned Books Are Books Worth Reading series around democracy, critical thinking, and conversation, drawing the reality of today to some of our history around the world, where censorship often leads to real breakdowns in democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, David. John?
Well, I'm going to be a little redundant because there are not that many official duties, but as my opponent said, the first and foremost is if something happens to the governor, and I'm very proud that the most popular governor in the United States has endorsed me because he sees me as a candidate that he can work with and trust. And I think it is super important to have someone that can work with the governor, but also government works better when there's balance. And right now, if it wasn't for Governor Scott, there would be no balance because of the supermajority. And that's part of the reason we're facing these astronomical increases in the cost of living. You do shuffle some papers, correct, from the Senate to the House and the governor's office, but other than that, the Committee on Committees is very important because it is important where people end up on committees, and presiding over the Senate is very important as well. I feel like I am prepared to take over as governor if I have to. I have 16 years of legislative experience and too many years to count of running my own business, and I believe that throughout all my connections and experience in government that I would be ready to take that on. But then the other interesting part is you can make it what you want it to be, and what I want to do is I want to use it to bring Vermonters' voices back to the State House. I believe that special interest has too much pull in the State House, and that regular Vermonters aren't listened to as much anymore. They operate inside a bubble, and everyday Vermonters who can't go to the State House and pay attention to what's going on need to be represented.
Thank you, John. The next question will be from the audience here. It's a follow-up question, and it'll be to John first and then to David. Before going on to these other questions, I do want to note that the any questions that I write or that the league writes, we need to write those in a neutral fashion. We can't slant them one way or the other. But sometimes when we get questions from the community, from the audience, the questions may have a slant to them, and that's appropriate because that's expressing the view of the person. And they also sometimes may have information that we don't all agree on. I'm not editing any of that. I'm going to share the information that the questioner provides, and we'll leave it up to the candidates and to the audience to decide which things you agree with. So this is a follow-up on the committee on committees. So for John first, please explain your priorities for the Senate committees and what you will have in mind that you want committees to accomplish as you form these committees. And the questioner asks in particular, hope this question doesn't get too complicated, they're particularly interested in health and welfare, housing, and transportation. So what would you want those committees to accomplish as you're forming them?
Well, first off, being in politics, we're quite used to slants, Tom.
Yes.
I think all committees are the same. We try to create balance. We try to put people who have an interest or experience on the committees that they want to be on. Not everyone can have their first pick, of course, but we try to create balance, and people are going to work harder and work better if it's a committee that they want to be on, and especially if they have experience in that committee. So those would be my priorities, is to fit people to their committees, but make sure there's as much balance as we can. Of course, right now in the Senate, there's many more Democrats than there are Republicans, so there's sometimes not enough Republicans, so there's one on every committee. So it's important to get them on the committees that they want to be on.
Thank you, John. David?
So I've had that role 3 times so far, and I appreciate my colleague here. I actually try not to call people opponents. I think we're both trying to run for an office. Sometimes people think folks are against each other. I like to reframe it so that we remember that we're all actually working for the common good and hoping to make the state a better place, regardless of which one of us wins. But there was a time when actually we didn't have a committee with a Republican on it, not because there weren't enough, but because we also tried to respect that at the time, none of the folks in the party wanted to be on the committee. We actually really went back to 2 or 3 of them over and over and said, you know, we really would like to have a Republican on this committee. And they said, well, we don't want to be there. I want to be on this other committee. So it's an interesting balance of trying to get geographic distribution, political party distribution, issue ideology, because within actually both the Republican, the Democratic, and the Progressive Party, there are ranges of views. None of them are monoliths. And so you do try to take folks to put them on the committees where both they have their own experience that might be related to the topic and knowledge, as well as the distribution of so many variables, gender as well. With respect to health and welfare, I think there's a couple of big issues in front of that committee. Obviously, it just blew up around the hospitals. And how do we make sure we have a healthcare system where we have medical facilities accessible for people all across the state within the boundaries of cost? And I think that's the conundrum we're facing on so many different topics. And it's not all just because the legislature passed certain policies, which is sometimes how things are framed, but it's societal shifts that are actually happening in states all across the country. These are not easy to solve, or we would have solved them already, regardless of whether we've been in the legislature for 16 years or 18 years, or one particular party or another. And then housing is huge. Again, like I said, I supported the House version of a bill, didn't get through the Senate this year, to put $70 million a year into affordable housing, and I'd like to make sure our tax committee and our housing committees work on that.
Thank you, David. And next question, we'll go to David first and then to John. So climate change is an important issue, and the flooding events of 2023 and 24 have made some people rethink where we zone housing, especially along rivers. Given rising demand for housing, how would you plan to address those concerns as Lieutenant Governor while pushing for increased housing?
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. On the one hand, we want to make sure, and the legislature passed a bill to do this, that larger developments of housing are relatively concentrated for both efficiency of building and cost, but also in near town and village centers where you have walkable access to services for whether it's younger folks or folks who are farther advanced in their years. At the same time, sometimes the Act 250 bill is conflated that then suddenly you can't build housing anywhere anymore, but in fact you can. And so there should and can be housing preferably closer to roads, so we're not building long fragmentary cuts up into the woods and out into the fields, but we can build housing throughout Vermont. Act 250 only limits larger scale building of housing. With respect to flooding, there's a number of factors that go into this. One is the intensity of climate. There are those that say we can't do more about climate. I would argue we have to. The cost of inaction, as we've seen these last 2 years, is huge economically. It is huge personally. It is impactful on businesses. And even just the heavy rains, I know we've both talked about our different crops being deeply impacted by these much wetter summers. Vermont has seen an increased average of about 7 inches of rain a year over the last few decades. And unfortunately, that's going to continue. And of course, we're looking at Florida right now. It's not just a Vermont problem. But crops are even impacted. You can't harvest your hay or your field crops if the ground is saturated, or leaf diseases and mold in different crops. So we can't be inactive. We have to be active. The crux of it is, though, and sometimes it's around the definition of progressive that some people seem to understand and maybe some don't. Progressive means have the folks with more means come up with the money to help deal with the issues that have come about. Because under Reaganomics and trickle-down, where money's concentrated at the top, we've seen 40 years of deferred maintenance on our schools, on our society, and on our climate.
Thank you, David. John?
Sure. I'd like to start with saying that Vermont does have one of the most progressive income tax systems that there is out there, so we have done great work on that. Resilience is key going forward. We know the storms are getting more powerful and they're coming more often. So we have to be sure that when we're building infrastructure that it's ready for those heavy storms. Unfortunately, Vermont was developed around the valleys for water power and for transportation, and so we do have some serious issues there. I disagree with my colleague on the Act 250 bill. I think the Act 250 bill made it so that wealthy people can still develop in the rural areas, but it's making it harder for regular people. Personally, I have a 1,000-foot driveway because there was not a house site until I got 1,000 feet up into my property. Under the new bill, I would have to go through Act 250. Act 250 was not designed for housing. It was designed for commercial real estate and development. The problem with large apartment complexes is manyfold. Number one, person renting their whole life never builds any equity. They never build any intergenerational wealth. I have a good friend that lives in what he calls the projects in Barrie, which is low-income housing. And he tells me horror stories about the people next door in all of the black Suburbans that roll in and out of there at night, and he suspects that they're trafficking both drugs and sex trafficking. And so sometimes these inner city developments don't go as well as they should. And we also have the problem of sewer overflows in many cities dumping raw sewage into our waterways, and I find that unacceptable.
Thank you, John. And next question, we'll go to John first and then to David second. Vermont has about 3,500 unhoused people, and the state's emergency motel program is winding down. Last week, officials from around the state held a press conference in Montpelier, calling on the governor and the legislature to do more to help these homeless Vermonters. What do you think the governor and legislature should do? Okay, John, then David.
Yeah, it's a complex problem. We need to make sure all our state agencies are working together because many of these folks have underlying issues with substance abuse disorder, mental illness. One of the problems, I did some research on it because I'd been hearing different rumors about how many people came from other places during and after the pandemic because of the voucher program. And from what I gathered through various reports, around 30% of the people came from other states. And it's tragic to have to deal with it, but we can hardly afford to take care of our own people. We really shouldn't have to take care of people coming here from other states because our policies are more generous. But we need to develop plans to deal with their underlying issues. I guess there have been some successes with pod communities. We need to make sure that we have access to those in places all around the state, because one of the things that's happened, and probably everybody from cities outside of Burlington is happy about it, but because Burlington offers so many services, everyone has migrated there, and their problem is just overwhelming at this point. And so it's an issue that we have to deal with. It'll take a lot of cooperation from government and community services. It's a complex issue that everybody's going to have to come together at the table and figure out how to address it and try to get as many of these folks as we can back on their feet so that they can have an independent and productive life.
Thank you, John. David?
Yeah, the housing crisis is huge. It's actually something that some of us have been highlighting year in and year out, long before COVID. And one of the, I don't know if it's an upside of COVID, but one of the realities of COVID is it made us as a society really reflect on what our moral values are. And is it okay to accept a certain number of people who, due to various circumstances, should just live outside? Is that what our moral values are all about? And the numbers did increase during COVID, as did the price of housing, as did the number of people that left cities to live in rural areas and bought up housing, as did the Airbnb move, which a lot of long-term rentals have become short-term rentals. And so there's been a whole combination of causes for this. And that's the thing, we have to look at the root causes, which include mental health, which includes substance use disorder. But also with respect to the numbers, it's these other factors as well. And one of those factors, according to the deep dig that Digger and VPR did, their number was 4%. Maybe it's 30%. It's somewhere between, but they did a lot of research and asked a lot of people. And what they found is that some of those folks that people say, well, they came from out of state, at that time, there were people who had left Vermont. They were born Vermonters who had left, and they came back. So do we say we don't want those people? I don't think so. I think we address the needs of the people here in the state. It's not where you're from. It's what can we do to help you get on your feet, be a productive member of society if you can. But now we're also seeing people getting evicted from the motel voucher program who have serious health issues. They can't necessarily ultimately become a, quote, productive member of society in the workforce because of a long-term health issue. So we need to pay attention to that. Again, I'll go back to the House bill that was going to put $70 million a year. It was a thought-through bill for 10 years of investment in affordable housing. And by the way, not all dense housing is rental. It can be mixed use and ownership as well. I've got to stop, but there's definitely more there. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Next question, we'll go to David first and then to John. And we have a few questions that we received in advance and from here tonight that are really follow up on some of the topics that have already been brought up. One of them here. How will you deal with the growing problem of drug use and crime, including driving under the influence, public consumption of drugs, break-ins, and illegal encampments? There are many places in Montpelier and St. Jay and other towns where you can no longer feel safe walking alone as a woman and where you don't want your kids to walk.
This is a very serious issue, and one that, particularly in Vermont, feels like a newer circumstance compared to folks that maybe have lived in larger cities or at other times in their life. And it doesn't mean it's okay that it's been there longer, but it's very real, and I hear it from people every day. The legislature last year passed a bill around retail theft. That was a step in the right direction, where they aggregate small thefts instead of treating them individually, that if you reach a certain threshold of value, you then are getting tried for them in aggregate. One problem with the bill is it's actually county-based. And so sometimes folks now they know the law, they'll steal a certain amount of things over 5 or 6 times, then they'll go to another county, and it sort of starts over. So I think that needs to be addressed. But it's also really important to recognize that I was just up at an event in Newport, or actually Orleans before this event, but there was a lot of folks from the Newport Correctional Facility. They're full. A lot of our prisons are full. So simply thinking we just lock people up isn't really a solution. A, it's very expensive, and B, it doesn't solve the problem. Many of them have substance use disorder. We know we have a great program in Jenna's Promise in Johnson. You've all heard about it. It's not cheap, but we need to replicate that all over the state so people have longer-term recovery, so they can truly wean themselves of the horror of the world of addiction. That is not something that's usually done by choice. I had a former employee who had an injury. He was prescribed OxyContin, and he ultimately became an addict. The drugs that we get, and my brother just had hip surgery. He got 30 OxyContin. He's like, no way. 1 or 2. I mean, hip surgery you actually tend to recover pretty fast from. You don't need 30 pills. And so we still have that problem going on. Again, there's so many. I will say, as far as illegal encampments, what do? Do you just throw everyone in jail? Do you scatter them to the wind? Or do we find safe places and say, let's make sure we have facilities, bathroom facilities, so you can be cleaner and safer? Because a lot of them think it's healthier to live in a group where they protect each other than alone, particularly some of the women.
Thank you, David. John?
Yes, on my tour of downtown Burlington, I talked with several people, 2 of the merchants who actually had recently had to run down and tackle people themselves stealing, and one of them said the guy was known to him. He'd been into his store and stolen from him in the past. And so it's a serious problem. Excuse me, the legislative bill that acted on retail theft helped, but there's a long ways to go. First off, we need to make sure our law enforcement is properly funded. Several years ago, the Burlington Police dramatically lost funding because of their city council, and now they don't have enough coverage, and people are literally afraid to walk to their cars after dark. So it's something that we have to deal with. The other thing that I've heard around Burlington, that the drug dealers, the drug traffickers are getting more violent, more territorial, and there are actual gang members from big dangerous gangs here now. It's not like they have a giant presence, but they're here, they're moving their poison into this state, and we need to give law enforcement and judiciary the tools they need to stop that, because that's where it all starts, is the trafficking and the heavy presence of drugs and pushing it onto Vermonters. We also need to do more in our schools for our youth, especially the ones the teachers often say they can identify in 4th or 5th grade as people who aren't learning well academically. And I would like to see them given more hands-on opportunity. If a child isn't learning well academically, give them a hammer, give them a wrench, give them apprenticeship, give them something that they enjoy and can do to help keep them out of trouble.
Thank you, John. With the current state of our mental health programs in Vermont, how do you see resources best used going forward? How do we change the bare minimum increases in Montpelier? This goes to John first, then David.
Yeah, that's a tough issue, and when we deinstitutionalized mental health in the state of Vermont, a whole bunch of people seem to have gotten turned out with not enough services. So we need to make sure that we build capacity in all our communities, because I think we have folks who need services in every community, and not generally is it just one state service they need. There may be a need for interagency work, but we have to make sure that these folks get the services they need and have housing or a place to stay. It's not a area that I ever worked on when I was in the legislature, so I won't profess to have the answers for it. But I think what needs to happen, as with many other problems in the state, is we need to bring all the stakeholders together. You know, the providers, the consumers, the state agencies, and we need to start working collaboratively to address all these issues, not just the mental health. It's the substance abuse, it's the homelessness, the mental health, and in many places, those three things have crossovers. It's a serious issue. It's costing us a lot of money, and these are real people with real families, and we need to make sure they have the services that they need.
Thank you, John. David?
Well, I think it's a fascinating question because it really brings together so many things we've been talking about already tonight. When we look at mental health, it's not only folks that are no longer in the housing facilities that were deinstitutionalized, but we are seeing the numbers explode. And the numbers who have mental health challenges are for a wide range of reasons. Economic duress leads to mental health struggles. Substance use disorder leads to mental health struggles. Being homeless often as well. Climate. I know a lot of young people who are seeking a lot of mental health counseling around the future for them to live either in Vermont or anywhere with the climate disasters that are happening. Even discourse and the negativity that's happening all across the country in the presidential race and sometimes in Vermont as well, but less so, thankfully, lead to these. So we have to work on those underlying issues. That is why I sometimes struggle when we hear we need to address sewerage, we need to address more programs in schools, we need more programs for drug use disorder, substance use disorder, housing, and then also the word saying, but Vermont's too expensive. Sooner or later, you have to square that circle. And for me, that's why I support, as I've said multiple times, I haven't yet heard how someone else would pay for these things. But that $70 million a year for housing, we know from a healthcare and a mental health perspective, if you address housing, you start to address many of these other challenges. Housing first model is a widely discussed topic. Now, do we do that perfectly? No. But simply doing market rate housing, building 1,000 or 2,000 a year when we're 10,000 behind is never going to create affordable housing. That's why we need that investment I've talked about a few times. And it can be mixed use so that it isn't all people of one income or another. You can actually look at Vienna in the 20s and 30s and how that government invested in housing and have a very successful community with healthy folks.
Thank you, David. The next question is also about mental health and has two parts to it. Do you see a correlation with the lack of mental health funding throughout the decades and the unfortunate increase in suicides? And the second part, do we have a gun problem or a mental health crisis? Okay, David first and then John.
I don't think most things are either or. I think sometimes the questions get posed as sort of bipolar. It's one thing or another. I think one of the great things about our society is we're no longer thinking in a bipolar way. Whether it's race, we recognize there's a lot more than two races. There's people of all kinds of wonderful backgrounds all over the world and in Vermont. We think of things bipolar when it comes to party. I actually run with two-party labels, both progressives and Democrat, because I believe we need to broaden the system. And when we think about mental health and we think about gun violence, they both are challenges. They both have distinct individual factors, but also they come together. A very dear friend, very successful legal scholar, woman in this state a number of years ago, committed suicide by gun. She bought that gun quickly and went and did it. Thankfully, we've changed our laws to make it a little bit of delay. We know that a delay in purchasing a gun by just 24 hours can often reduce suicides. We know that we need to make mental health and suicide hotlines more and more available and reduce the stigma that if you have a circumstance and you need help, you should be able to talk about it and ask for it. We need to reduce stigma in many arenas in society, and we've been doing that, which is really important. I do believe in gun violence prevention, while also still making sure people have the right to have their guns for their own personal safety or for hunting and so forth. But nobody imagined when our Constitution was written, that of the power and the speed with which, for instance, assault rifles or rapid fire rifles or whatever terminology people want to use, we don't have to debate the language. The reality is there are weapons out there that can kill far too many people far too fast. And I don't think we should continue to have those be available for purchase. Doesn't mean taking them away from anybody, but at least we can stop the influx.
Thank you, David. John?
Yeah, it's interesting that my colleague mentioned economic distress before, and his policies and the policies of the legislature are driving the economic distress. Hundreds of millions of dollars have been added to the cost of living for Vermonters each of the last 2 years. Property taxes, $100 million added on to our electric bills, which is so regressive. It bothers me so much because the majority of that money goes to wealthy energy developers, and it's been going on for years. My colleague has solar panels on his barn. Solar panels are great, but poor people pay the tax shift, the cost shift, to help folks who have solar panels on their buildings. Department of Public Service did a study. They determined that most people who have solar panels in the net metering program are affluent white people. Poor people are helping them pay for that, and the majority of that cost shift is going to wealthy energy developers. So economic distress is driving a lot of the mental illness problems and suicide problems. I think it's a societal problem. When I was in high school, we used to take our rifles to school during hunting season. Nobody ever thought of shooting another person. I distinctly remember going out at lunchtime, and all of us boys would show each other what we hunted deer with. We would talk about deer hunting stories. There's a serious issue with the mental health in this society, and we need to address it. And yes, people with violent tendencies and serious mental health problems should not be able to have firearms. But I don't think law-abiding citizens should lose their rights for that reason.
Thank you, John. The next question from the audience here. What are new ways Vermont can create revenue without raising taxes? For example, turning used VTSU dorms into housing. John, and then David.
We don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem. Vermonters are overtaxed and overregulated already. We have no more capacity for taxes, and we have to go through all of our systems just like a business would, and we need to weed out the fat. Plain and simple, Vermonters that I've talked to all around the state are taxed to death. You cannot believe the number of people who have been here for generations that I have talked to who have said, when my kids get out of school, we're leaving this state. We can't afford to live here anymore. When I retire, we're leaving this state. We can't afford to live here anymore. When you look at the income potential compared to the cost of living in Vermont, we're one of the most expensive places to live in the entire country. That is not okay. We're driving people out, and pretty soon it's going to be a playground for the rich and famous, and that's not the Vermont I want to see. I want to see regular people be able to live here and not have to work 7 days a week. That's what's happening right now. My wife and I, the majority of our life, we work 6 and 7 days a week. We went on a vacation last spring and took the whole family to the ocean in Florida. And she looked at me while we were sitting on the beach and she said, "This is the first time you've taken a vacation in 20 years. And I said, "Doesn't seem that long, but you're probably right." We were doing a rally at the State House and somebody yelled from the back, "How about a vacation?" There are thousands of Vermonters who never get to take a real vacation because there's no money left. We are overtaxed, overfeed, and being chased out of here by the legislature's lack of common sense and affordability.
Thank you, John. David?
I think you talked about how to make jobs without raising taxes, and I think there's a number of factors there. One is there are jobs right now, and a lot of them can't be filled because, and I'm going back to housing again, there isn't housing. There have been businesses that have tried to recruit, whether it's Vermonters or folks from afar, and without the housing, they've been unable to recruit them. So I do think we have to invest in housing, and yes, that takes taxes. Sometimes when you run a business, you actually have to invest in the business to make the business successful. And I would argue investing in housing is actually investing in our economy and our workforce. I would also add that a topic I have tried to work on with the governor, I thought we could actually do it very well together, particularly being of different parties, because we have a 2-year term. It's very difficult to tackle the bureaucracy of governance because you can't usually show big results within 1 year when then you're back on the cycle of electioneering. And I said to him, if we both do it together, they can't attack the left or the right. If we say human services and education, the two by far biggest parts of our state budget, have an overlap. Every family in human services that has kids are in our education system. But we have a tremendous bureaucratic duplicity. We have it where information can't be shared. It costs us more in taxpayer dollars for state employees. And it means often kids get the attention or the work they need from the school side or the human services side in a delayed fashion. And we know if you address these issues earlier in the process of a young child's development, it actually costs much, much less to actually get it done to where they're actually resolving those issues. So as a non-tax, property tax saving, governmental bureaucracy saving measure, I will continue to seek to work with the governor and the legislature to tackle that issue. So that's not a tax issue, although there's others I could talk about.
Okay. Thank you, David. Next question. What is the most important legislation you have backed in the past year and why? David, then John.
Wow. I hate these questions because we can often, frankly, walk and chew gum and tap our head at the same time. And when I think about the economic future for our state, and I think about the climate package that did pass through the House and Senate to deal with waterways and resilience, to deal with investing in both the resilience but also renewable energy to tackle climate. And I do want to point out, by the way, that over time it has been proven that renewable energy is actually much more cost stable and less sporadic than fossil fuel. It also is more investment in state jobs than fossil fuel, where I think it's 80 or 90% of the dollars go out of state when we buy fossil fuels. And so the package of different environmental bills around the climate crisis are not only investing in our economy, working to save Vermonters money both over time, but also through hopefully fewer disasters, as we and everybody else recognizes around the world, we have to change our consumptive habit of fossil fuels. But also through economic development. I think it really covers a wide range of things. But, you know, again, it didn't pass both chambers, but the House version of a tax on the playground of the wealthy, the 1%. You know, the folks making over $500,000 a year to invest in housing, which also is a climate part of the package. Because if you build up and not out, you have a smaller footprint. You build density so you can move towards more public transportation, which is also economic development and climate related. These pieces are all interrelated. And so to me, those are a couple different ones. And I know you said one, but I can't stick to that.
Okay. Thank you, David. John?
Well, I wasn't in office last year, so I'm at a loss.
Well, what'd you support anyway? Did you support something?
Well, during your 16 years.
Well, the most fun bill that I ever wrote and passed was the specialty beer bill, which allowed our brewers to start making beer of over 8% alcohol by volume. And that was a very interesting bill because there was a debate on the floor, and a lot of times things are very partisan, and this one was not partisan at all. There were people all over the place, And it's also been a huge success in economic development. We have a huge beer economy, and people actually come here and do beer tours and spend thousands of dollars in our economy. One of the ones I'm most proud of, though, is the tax department was giving farmers a hard time on farm equipment. Supposedly plowing snow in your driveway was not a farm-related operation, and so if you plowed snow with your big tractor, it wasn't tax exempt. And so I got the percentage of that dropped so that farmers could actually plow snow, which I think is part of a farm operation. But when we talk about renewable energy, my colleague and I disagree on a lot of areas. I support renewable energy, but I don't support the child and slave labor going on in the Congo, where they're producing over 70% of the cobalt in the world, which is going into our batteries. I don't support solar panels built in China in sweatshops. I want renewable energy that is built on the built environment, so it's not destroying farms and forests. I want it to be American made so that we know it's made with clear labor and environmental standards. We can't destroy a people and an environment on the other side of the world and call it green when it gets here.
We'll point out we tend to actually agree on a lot of those things. So for folks that sometimes think there's always fights, I think we work together on beer, we work together on cannabis, and on the tractor bill. So a lot of things. Yeah, I was chair of ag when we did raw milk, that's right. And so I just want to let people know there's daylight and commonality. It's not always differences.
Great. Thank you both. Next question. John and then David. What is your biggest concern for the average Vermonter?
My biggest concern is affordability. I've talked with people all around the state who are wondering how to pay their property taxes, electric bills, and fuel costs. The cost of living, the legislature is responsible, not for groceries, they can't control that, not for building materials, but property taxes they can control, and they were negligent in not dealing with this problem long ago. Anybody with half a brain saw it coming. They've studied it 38 times, which means they knew that there was a serious problem. I'm worried about more people becoming homeless. I talked with a guy who works for a financial institution and he evicts people. He said it's horrible how many places he has had to go to. And he says a lot of them, when he walks in there, you can tell that these people were destitute. He says there's piles of garbage and alcohol bottles and broken children's toys. And he said it's sad to walk into them. And I'm afraid if the legislature continues on the path that they're on, that more people are going to lose their homes, more people are going to have to move out of state, more people are going to have to work 7 days a week, and that's not okay. I grew up in a family, we lived within our means, we had a budget. The legislature is spending beyond the means of Vermonters.
Thank you, John. David?
Well, I think we agree on the broad topic of affordability, there's no doubt. The question is, how do you address it? And I've been very clear, and I've also disagreed with the legislature on many policies over the years, because I do think, in part, due to the mantra of no taxes across the board, they've ended up going to the folks who have less political power, which is actually folks with less money, and it's around fees, or it's around splinter taxes. I have been very clear, and it's actually the definition of progressive, that those who are wealthier, who have benefited from the tax breaks over decades, and who have accumulated more wealth and are making higher incomes, can afford to pay more, so that other Vermonters can afford to live here and pay less. So I'll give you some examples. I've advocated for years that the income sensitivity provisions of property taxes go across the full spectrum, because actually, even with the income sensitivity adjustment on property taxes, folks making over $400,000 pay a lower percentage of their income towards property taxes than working class people. It's about a $30 million tax shift on the back of working people. Folks like the governor and others have stood in the way of that. I do vocalize those differences and fight against it. Do you know that we have 58,000 second homes in Vermont? That is the second highest percentage of homes that are second homes anywhere in the country. I think, relative to property taxes, they can pay a progressively higher rate on the higher value, and that can go to the ed fund and lower taxes for ordinary working people. I believe in that marginal income tax on incomes over $500,000, so we can actually build affordable housing. And as was said, the costs are fixed, the materials and labor and land. You can't magically make them less expensive unless you put money into them from the state. And so it's not just affordability, no taxes. It's actually affordability, shift taxes, address taxes, and make Vermont more affordable for working people.
Thank you, David. And next question for David and then for John. How can Vermont provide quality education for all students despite rising costs, needed capital improvements, and decreasing student population? Should we be consolidating more schools?
So, I believe, am I first? Is that right?
You're first, yes.
Okay, thank you. So a couple things. I did serve on the education committee, and we did a first round of consolidation that really caused a lot of consternation for folks, because people do really want to support their local schools and their local school boards and not lose, quote, local control. That saved some money. It caused consternation. I do think we could actually do more in that arena, but the reality is the numbers don't really add up that saves the kind of money that is what everybody would want to see. So it's really important to make sure people recognize consolidation is not the savior of our education system from a financial perspective. It is a piece of what needs to be a many-piece pie. We also send a lot of money out of state with students. We need to really review that. We also need to really review, after the Supreme Court decision, our policies with respect to public money going to private schools. I don't mind it going to private schools if they also have to open their doors to every kid from the community that wants to go. They can't be selective and cherry pick and leave the more expensive kids on the public schools, which now will have less diversity of knowledge and skill sets, where kids help each other with that diversity. So I think there are issues there to address to make sure there's more equality, which is around better education. So consolidation can be a piece. Looking at where our dollars go can be a piece. And as I said earlier, there's a big area between human services and education, which is about restructuring governance and bureaucracy to make that side of it more cost effective. And I'll offer that in the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen about a $60 to $100 million tax shift by this administration that says no taxes, by not doing what other states do, which is cover human services and mental health with the human services budget in other states. Whereas here it's covered in the education fund, and that's been a tax shift on property taxpayers by this governor in his budgets.
Thank you, David. John?
I would agree that it has been a tax shift, but it's money coming out of one of our pockets or the other. The bottom line is we're spending too much on education and not getting good results. Our test scores are terrible, and so that's why I say the entire education system, both how we educate our youth and how we fund it, needs to be started over from scratch and build the system that we want. We first need to look at school buildings. There are a lot of school buildings that are not safe, don't fit programmatically. Are we going to rebuild those, or is there another school nearby where we can do consolidation where it makes sense? We're topographically challenged in Vermont. Not every area is going to be able to consolidate, but a lot of them can. And likely in a lot of those places, we can offer more and better services for the kids and offer them a better education and extracurricular and sports and all those other things that are so essential to a child's overall well-being. But over and over in the studies that have been done, it's been determined we have to reduce administration. It's hugely expensive, and there are cities and states around the country that have a larger population than Vermont that have one supervisory union. We have to reduce it, at least down to, like one per county or something like that. And we have to start making efficiencies, possibly statewide teacher contracts and in statewide buying power under fewer administrations. It's a huge topic and can't be covered in 2 minutes.
Thank you, John. Next question will go to John first and then to David. I'm going to combine questions from two people. One we received ahead of time and one from here tonight. Last week, a consultant issued a detailed 144-page report recommending sweeping changes to the Vermont healthcare system, including repurposing the inpatient units at some hospitals, consolidating services, moving some services out of hospitals, and changing how hospitals are paid. The report estimates that without changes, the state will need to spend $2.4 billion to subsidize hospitals over the next 5 years. Without that, some hospitals could face bankruptcy. I'm hoping that you have read this report or a summary of it. Please share your thoughts.
You're first.
Please.
It was a reasonably long report, so I did not read the whole thing.
It's only 144 pages.
Yeah.
It's been out for like 5 days.
And I haven't had anything else to do.
Well, if the questioner does ask, please share your thoughts on the solutions he recommended and how you propose to have the Senate start working on solutions.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, we can't lose any of our community hospitals. Every community deserves a hospital, and who wants their loved one to be in Burlington or in Dartmouth if they live in St. Albans or the Northeast Kingdom? They're so essential to our community. We must first make sure we have access to primary care. Community-based health centers look for opportunities. In some jurisdictions, they're now using ambulance and emergency services to do home visits for people. So especially with people who are mobility challenged or elderly, where the service can go right to them. And there's been huge savings there. Telemedicine has been another huge saver in a lot of instances. It cuts down on people's time in the car, and the whole climate change thing, and in many instances it works great. We also need to address the shortage in healthcare professionals, and I think giving loan forgiveness for people who train to be doctors, dentists, nurses, and serve in underserved areas and are dedicated to staying in the state for a period of years, I think is essential. My wife is a registered nurse, works at Surgical Associates up here at NVRH, and I know they're doing better now, but for a long time, they had a ton of visiting nurses in locums, which add a tremendous amount to the budget. So we need to do more to support our dedicated staff and more to encourage youth and adults to go into training in these fields where so much help is needed.
Thank you, John. David?
Well, there's a lot there. I do want to start with saying that I have earned the AFT endorsement. AFT is the largest union representing nurses in the state because folks who are nurses deserve to get fair pay and decent working conditions, and it was really remarkably bizarre how much money the travelers got, more than folks who live in our community and work in our community. And so I've stood with those nurses for years, both organizing and in contract negotiations. A stable workforce is the first way to have stable pricing, because when you have turnover, you have more problems, more costs, more issues. I agree with my colleague. I think he probably meant every region needs a hospital, not every community. Because I think if we had 240 hospitals, that might be a bit expensive. But I know that's what you meant. Sure. But I do not support the sort of fundamentals that came out of that report, at least what little I've seen so far. And I, like my colleague, as farmers, it's a tough time of year to sit down and read 145 pages. But one thing I did learn already is that when they did the report on North Country, they indicated they thought there were about 200 births every 2 years, and it's actually 200 births every year. So if some of the statistics that are in the report are already being shown to be inaccurate, I think it's really important to take a little bit of time and really dig into such reports and make sure the information is accurate first. But there's no doubt, in my opinion, we have had a sick care system in this country for a very, very long time. We actually need a health care system. A system where people get healthy food, like our kids in schools. Getting healthy meals throughout the day actually leads to healthier outcomes and better education. Our governor wanted to cut universal school meals. Investing again in housing is actually healthcare related. People who are living out in the communities or living in substandard housing often have more health issues. So again, these things are all connected. I've got the red flag, so I'll stop.
Thank you, David. The next question for David first, and then John. How do you see the lieutenant governor working with the governor and also working on your own?
Sure, a couple things. I can't answer for why the governor, when we were first elected in 2016, and we'd been colleagues and had good rapport, met with me in his transition and literally said, "You're not going to be a part of my administration." There's not much I can do with that. I did meet with him in June of that year and said, here's some ideas, like I said earlier, around government restructuring. I said, I knew he wasn't a big fan of taxes, so I wasn't going to go in saying, raise this tax to pay for this or that. I said, let's look at human services and education, reduce the bureaucracy, save money, create better outcomes. That's not a left or a right or a Republican or progressive or Democrat. That's good governance. I said, or we could do another idea. Let's look at Lyme disease, which is striking people across the state of all political persuasions, whether you're a hunter or a hiker, whether you're a farmer or any electric line worker. It's devastating people in this state, including my spouse, so I know a lot about it. And Vermont's highest per capita in the country. Let's join Johns Hopkins and Stanford as leading research institutions at UVM Medical Center with a research position that we could fund by you asking donations from wealthy Republicans. I'll ask for donations from wealthy Democrats and progressives, not government money. So I'm open to all kinds of ideas that are not about taxes, that are about collaborative work. The administration chose a different path. I'll continue to work with the governor as soon as he's ready to work together.
Thank you, David. John?
Yes, I've actually worked with the governor for years and very proud to have his endorsement because he wants a lieutenant governor that he can work with. And so I look forward to it. I am also planning on doing a lot of my own work. I have issues that I want to work on. And number one, as I said before, I want to bring regular everyday Vermonters' voices back into the State House. I want to make sure that what's happening in the State House gets out so the public can understand it, because often the media doesn't cover things in depth. They use the talking points of the majority and the minority, and then they move on to the next issue. Vermonters need to understand how these bills are going to affect them. One thing that I would like to correct that my colleague just said, he said the governor wanted to cut school meals. The governor wanted rich people to have to pay for their own school meals. So he didn't really want to cut them for the people who need them. He just wanted to cut them for wealthy people, which I understand the reason the legislature didn't want to do it. They want all kids to look like they're equal. But Vermonters have to realize there's a pretty significant cost. And if we took all those 38 studies that the legislature has done and put on the shelf and hasn't done anything with, that cost us millions of dollars, we could have bought a lot of kids' school meals. So yes, I'm looking forward to working with the governor and hoping that I can take on some of his priorities and do that work around the state.
Thank you, John.
I didn't actually use all my time. Can I throw 20 seconds back, which was about what I had?
That isn't in the rules.
Okay, that's why I asked. If he says no,
Okay.
that's fine.
We're
I mean, he
almost to
invoked
closing
me,
statements.
which is a little
so
different.
Hold on to it for a second.
Yeah.
Yeah. So 2 more questions and then closing statements. So this one will be John first, and then David. The combination of a stagnant population, a shortage of workers, and a shift to more older residents are creating numerous challenges for Vermont. How would you, as Lieutenant Governor, address these issues?
Well, first we go right back to affordability. When I look at my community in the Northeast Kingdom and I see what the income potential is for a young person, and then I look at the average cost of a house and the average property taxes, the last report I saw, Vermont was the 3rd highest taxed state in the country. Our electricity costs are among the highest. I think we were number 10 highest electricity cost. With the influx of people who work in places like Boston and New York and other areas that have high income, they come here and they think a $500,000 house is a bargain. But a kid who lives and works in the Northeast Kingdom cannot make the payment on a $500,000 house. So we need to make sure that every tax dollar we spend is being spent wisely and that all our systems are working efficiently. And I think when you look back to those 38 studies, you will find that nobody believes our education system is working efficiently. And I think the same thing needs to happen in state government. We're a very small population with a very large state government. We need to make sure that Vermonters are getting what they're paying for, and I don't believe they are right now. So we need to make sure our kids have opportunity for both a good K through 12 education, as well as opportunity to go to higher learning. But the big problem is keeping our kids here. And then I talk with other young people who have moved here. They don't want to live in apartments in the city. They want a small house and a small piece of land where they can have a garden and raise their own food and be independent and connected to nature. And so we need to make sure they're able to do that.
Thanks, John. David?
Yeah, I really appreciate a lot of the sentiments of my colleague. I didn't hear really any specific proposals to do it. I've heard a lot about the 38 studies, and they've shown all these programs. I haven't heard my opponent really talk about what in those studies he would have implemented or advocated for. And the reason I point that out is sometimes we can all say a lot of things to make people feel good about where we stand on issues or the broader values and challenges that are facing our state, but it actually takes doing the work. It takes specifics. I've been very clear and specific around housing. We talked about the ability to buy housing. Well, the cost of housing is high because of those external forces. Just doing nothing isn't going to change that. It's not just even permit adjustments isn't going to change that. There are folks coming into the state who can afford to pay a lot more, and the cost of the materials and the labor themselves just simply make it more expensive. So I've given you specifics. Marginal income tax rate on the wealthiest people in Vermont. I've talked about issues like electricity that actually stabilize prices. We didn't talk about the fact that one of the reasons the Northeast is more expensive for electricity is it happens to have one of the most concentrated populations of people. And the Southeast has, if we know your history, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which federal government built the dams, and they've had cheap electricity for a very long time. We actually have some of the most stable pricing and have been getting better and better on our prices compared to other parts of the country over the last 10, 20 years because of the policies. Does it make it as cheap as we'd like it to be? No, but we've actually stabilized a lot of prices. And so it's important to name the problem. It's also important to name the solutions. So yes, we need fundamentally more housing in Vermont, but also more affordable housing. And I've presented those solutions.
Thank you, David. And for the last question, it will be David and then John. And the question is about the lack of affordable childcare in Vermont. It's especially a large problem for parents who need to work. What would you do as Lieutenant Governor to alleviate this issue?
Well, there's a lot of different factors that have gone into this, but the legislature passed landmark legislation and overrode the governor, and yes, it had a tax, but the outcome of that legislation is that numerous home and larger child care facilities around the state are now investing. They're expanding their slots. They're expanding how many kids they're going to have. It's expanded how much money is available to help low-income people pay for the child care so they can go to work. Because we know that with the wages out there, for many, it was more valuable to stay home with your children than go get a job and pay more than what you could make or close to it to have your child in childcare, particularly if you had 2 or 3 children. It was a no-brainer. So we've increased supports for people to pay for childcare. We've increased supports to childcare facilities, whether in-home or larger, to make sure the wages for workers are better, which has enabled them to keep workers and expand how many kids they can take. So the state has made what is regarded across the country as landmark, forward-thinking legislation to invest in our child care system so that families can have child care that's good for their kids and the socialization that happens in child care and the early learning so they can be better prepared to go to school and improve those outcomes in schools, which, by the way, are actually much better than my opponent talked about. Vermont schools are ranked about 10th in the country. Earlier on, we start behind, but actually our education system brings a lot of kids into a better outcome in the long run. Are there examples where it doesn't? Of course there are, but as a whole, our education system is quite good. But starting it with early childcare is an incredible investment. Yes, it costs my business and yours some money. It also costs the individuals some money who work off our paychecks, but it's an invaluable investment.
Thank you, David. John?
It's also some of the most education spending in the country per pupil. Childcare super important. I know my wife quit her job when we had our second child because she was basically working for childcare and figured she might as well stay home and raise her own kids. But one of the things that happened years ago, the legislature changed the standards of what child care providers needed for training, and we lost a huge number of people who took care of kids in their own homes for many years that were outstanding child care providers, but they didn't want to go back to school, they didn't want to do the training, they didn't want to meet all the standards, and so a huge number of them went out of business. And so, yes, I believe that we need to have quality child care, but many of these people, they treated these kids like their own kids. They were wonderful, learning experiences, nurturing children, and they were as much quality as I've ever seen, but they couldn't meet the standards. And then one other thing that my opponent said was about electric rates. My opponent supported electric rates of 20 cents a kilowatt hour for net metering when we were buying it for 6 cents a kilowatt hour from Hydro-Quebec. That's part of the reason that we have among the highest energy costs in the entire nation. Also, he keeps mentioning that I don't have a plan. First off, it's hard to get to a plan in 2 minutes, but he hasn't listened. Over and over in every debate we've had, I said we need to cut administration, where a massive amount of our property tax money goes.
Thank you, John. So, moving on to closing statements. And first we have David Zuckerman.
Well, thank you all. It's been a lovely evening, and thank you for staying through, and I'm happy to stay afterwards to answer any questions, or folks can always go to my website, Zuckerman, F-O-R-V-T, both to learn more about me, but you can also email my campaign info@zuckerman4vt.com if you have follow-up questions that you didn't get an answer that you needed to hear or that you had a question. I have a long history of collaborative work in the State House. I was the first third-party chair in the State House when I was a legislator in the House. And I had a committee with Democrats, Republicans, Independents, and Progressives. It was the only committee with sort of all 4 quadrants represented, and we had numerous unanimous votes. As the Lieutenant Governor, I've presided over the Senate in a way that many have said is both one of the most efficient and fair leaderships of the Senate they've seen, both from appointments but also how the process works. I have worked for a progressive agenda, and I'm not afraid to say it, for a long time, where we look to make sure everybody has their basic needs met. I have not always won that battle to make it in a more progressive tax system. The legislature is the one that makes that decision. Sometimes my opponent just equates me to the legislature. I haven't voted in the legislature for 10 years. I value all people. All people bring something to the table. I don't point fingers at people based on their background, where they come from, where they were born, in-state, out-of-state, man, woman, wherever in the world or Vermont they're from. I think that's really important in this day and age. I believe it's really important to invest in our kids. They're our future. They're our leaders. They're our workforce. That's important to invest in their childcare. It's important to invest in their education, but we need to do it in a more progressive and efficient way, which you've heard me talk about the specifics on many, many times. And yes, I support renewable energy. When I see a wind turbine, or if there were to be one, as I've been asked, near my farm, I think about my 18-year-old daughter and the next 60 years of her life and think there's actually a hope that we're not going to face these kinds of storms every single year. Thank you.
Thank you, David. John Rogers.
Personally, my opponent and I could not be more different. He grew up privileged in a wealthy part of a wealthy state. I grew up in the Northeast Kingdom on a dairy farm. It's clear that it's influenced our values. I'm an open and honest person. My opponent, I'm not thinking so much he is anymore. Because a couple times in his newsletters, I've found him spreading misinformation. He said, I opposed the $15 minimum wage bill, which I did, but he didn't go on to admit that I supported the later version after it had been improved. And when I asked him if he paid his farm help $15 an hour, he admitted that he did not. Imagine a millionaire who pays his help poverty wages. My opponent pretends a lot. He does not seem to be open and honest with the voters. He pretends he's a Democrat, to be a poor farmer, to support a livable wage, and to support women in the workplace. I just think that I'm an open and honest person, and that is what you will get with me in the office of Lieutenant Governor, because it will not only be my office, it will be the office of the people of Vermont, so that their voice is in the State House. I am proud to have Governor Scott's endorsement as a Lieutenant Governor he can work with, and whom he can trust to work through the difficult and trying times ahead. I'm the only candidate who will respect everyone's constitutional rights, and I'm the only candidate who will work to make Vermont more affordable, more safe, in a place that we can all be proud of. I'm John Rogers, and I'm asking for your vote on November 5th. If you want more information on me, you can check it out at rogersforvt.com. Thank you, and thank you to the host and for this absolutely spectacular venue. Good night.
Thank you, John. Would it be appropriate for us to do another 30 seconds for each of you, or are we good?
I'm good.
I'd be happy to address a couple of allegations, but if...
It's difficult at the very end when someone doesn't have a chance to respond to something specific. So if you'd each like another 30 seconds, we'll do that. So David first.
So a couple things. The research I was given about minimum wage was that you hadn't. So I accept that you did. And with that error, I'll apologize for that.
Thank you.
Second, when I supported minimum wage, like many small business owners, what I said was, let's increase it faster than inflation. But like anything, if you jump at $3 in a year, most small businesses would suffer for that. But I've always paid above the minimum wage, and I was not a millionaire during those conversations. So I think that's very disingenuous. You've never asked what my circumstances were. You addressed others, and frankly, I've forgotten what they are because they were so absurd. But I would hope that as I open the conversation, as I will continue to do, that we have open and honest conversations and ask questions of each other before making allegations. Thank you.
Thank you, David. John, are you?
Yes, and I would say my frustration comes from reading my opponent's letters, and when he tries to tie me to the Trump campaign and the MAGA movement. He knows me. He's worked with me for years. I served as a Democrat. I'm a never Trumper, much to the chagrin of a lot of Republicans. It is basically my opponent and the progressives that drove me out of the Democratic Party because they no longer care about working people in the state.
Thank you, John. Thank you to both of the candidates. I'm going to turn this back over to Pelham Cohn from the League of Women Voters.
Thank you.
We are delighted you join us this evening and hope this forum gave you the opportunity to learn more about your candidates for Lieutenant Governor. On behalf of the League of Women Voters of Vermont, I want to thank you, the candidates, for their response to a wide range of questions, KTV for live streaming and recording this forum, Johnsbury Athenaeum for great and very nicely hosting us, our moderator, Tom McCann, for our volunteers, and you, our audience and viewers, for your interest in this election. The League would like to remind you to vote on Tuesday, November 5th. You may have already received your ballot. I just received mine today before coming here. I haven't opened it, but I will do when I go back, which will continue to be mailed to all registered voters up to October 1st. You can vote your ballot early by mailing it to your town clerk, dropping it off at a ballot drop box or at your town clerk's office, or taking it to your polling place on election day. You will need to re-register if you moved or change your name. If you want to know more about your candidates, the League has a nonpartisan voters guide at votefor11.org, so you can always visit that and learn more. Every vote counts, and we know this to be the case in Vermont. So we urge you to make the effort, make a decision, make a difference, vote. Thank you for coming here today, and have a wonderful night. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.